Thank you, Bangalore Lit Festival, for this space, and particularly Farah Bashir for inviting me to have a conversation about her wonderful book. It's an honor to be here, and I'm zooming in from Melbourne. So, I like to pay respect to the indigenous people of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So thank you so much for writing this book, Farah. And this is going to be a conversation, and so I'm just going to keep it as a conversation and give you plenty of time to tell us about the wonderful journey with this book. One of the thoughts that I had as I read this book, being from Nagaland myself, and being also connected to the justice movement in the region that I come from, Northeast India. This book touched many of our hearts, and I speak as in we, the collective, young, old, people like myself, thinking about many issues about justice. And I really enjoyed this book, and I'm going to pick up maybe short snippets from your beautiful book. Can you tell us the journey that you had, first of all, writing this book, and what was it that allowed you the time to reflect on a memoir like this?
Thank you, Dolly. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Bangalore Lit Fest, for this space, like you said. And I feel so honored to be in a conversation with you, with someone, when you read the book and you shared your journey and your, anecdotes from childhood, it's like how many of us have these shared histories that we haven't heard of till now. And it was really that I was like, if I have to have this conversation with someone, I would love to have it with you. And I requested you to be a part of this because, the way you engaged with the text was so special. And to write this story, I think it wouldn't be very different from your own experience. I mean, to talk about Kashmir or any place, conflict-ridden place, it's like most of the times what you hear and read is all about death. So whether it's newspapers, whether it's videos, whether it's photographs, either it's beauty, extreme beauty, or it's atrocities and death and torture. And life somehow gets sort of missed in all of this, so you have, and I wanted to write about that particular aspect. I wanted to write about life. I have been a journalist myself, and I used to edit footage, stories from Basra. I was a sub-editor with Reuters, and from Iraq and other regions in the world, which showed similar atrocities. And what I really missed was, or thought about, not really missed, but thought about the lives, because I had also had a similar childhood, a similar life. So I wanted to deliberately stay away from what was from the reportage and talk about and write about life, because we miss that. I mean, if that gets missed, our point of empathy is always hanging. You don't know where to start.
I think that gives me a chance to dive into your book, and there's a chapter in the book you write about listening to music and how your sister and you listen to a lot of beautiful music from India, and also I think from across the border, music streaming from Pakistan. And I remember that you spoke about the tape recorder that you had at home and how that was so central for you to grow up as a little girl. And there's a moment where you begin to write about the violence and the house searches and how your family, your father had to wrap the tape recorder in a piece of cloth and put it in a cupboard and seal it. There was a particular night when the armed forces had come to your house and they found the tape recorder, and they abused your father and your family as to how dare they could listen to music. I think that line really made me wonder and reflect on my own growing as well in Nagaland, I grew up, and you and I are contemporaries. That's something that we found out in our conversations previously. It really made me think about how music was so central in our lives as well as children, Naga children growing up. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of art, songs, music, and how the idea that you wrote about the music stopping in a life and what it means for us to reflect on art?
Sure. So what I was telling you earlier about life, like wanting to write about life, music, poetry, art is where life exists. And but what you also saw when I was growing up, you also saw in mainstream Bollywood with films like Roja, etc. That was also getting erased. Your own voice. I mean, in Kashmir, in ordinary households, when you're doing your morning ritual of cleaning the house, setting the breakfast table, etc., you also switch on the radio transistor, and inevitably you keep listening to Kashmiri songs, you keep listening to music. We have this amongst many poets. We have Mahjur, who was very popular in the 1930s, and his poetry gets now adapted into songs and contemporary music. What you see world across, like South Asians largely. Recently, there was this Pakistani artist, Aruj Aftab, who got nominated at the Grammys twice in two categories to sort of contemporize the lyrics and the music from old poets. And that's something that what the artists in Kashmir are doing as well. Coming back to the point that you started your day with music, you started listening to it. So it was it was like a very intrinsic part of our days, of our ordinary day. And then I think there was also my cousin who was a student who was studying music, and I was very close to her. And she introduced me to a lot of music, and she used to always keep listening, etc., or playing harmonium. Now you see how many people who know about Kashmir or have interest can imagine a Kashmiri woman playing harmonium or listening to music. So I found that it was also a way to fight that erasure, to show how there are women who live in conflict zones, in territories like that, where they have a life. And that, when there are unresolved disputes which lead to that, and then they are very conveniently put in binaries, either this or that. And then there is this life which gets, again, I think music, poetry, through it was basically a representation of life. And for me also, it was also about stability, because that cousin of mine was studying music before 1990s, and then the 90s happened, the insurgency erupted, and dense militarization took over Kashmir completely. That was also a point of stability for a young girl, for a teenage girl. So what were the points of, when I was looking back and reflecting on those years, what were the points of, good or bad, stability or familiarity? Because life was changing on an hourly basis. So yeah, many layers to it. It didn't really come from one aspect. It was from like ordinary days to stability to expressing oneself through music.
Farah, I think that part about music really touched me, because the Northeast also shares a border with many, I think, other international, kind of neighbors that we have. And there is a part, I think, where you write about staying awake past midnight, waiting for the Nepal radio channel. I think it's around 1 in the morning when they would play Hindi songs, and you would quietly stay awake with the radio. It made me reflect on the kind of conditioning we have for regions that share international borders, and how we grew up with a conditioning to actually demonize our neighbors. In the Northeast as well, till today we find the Chinese radio kind of waves, frequency. The first cartoon that I watched as a Naga kid was Casper, and that was from a Bhutanese television that was kind of like hitting the frequency. And your book really made me reflect about the similar journeys that is there in terms of living really very close to borders. And about language, I remember as a child too, when my mother found me doing mischievous things, she would raise her eyebrows and she would say a phrase, Hario Samba, right? And I would look at my mother mischievously and run away. I think you, at the same time in this book, talk about the richness of language that you grew up with. And you're very free to write about Hindi and the influence about Hindi in your life. And at the same time, Urdu and so many other languages. Found it really fascinating. So I think that was the connection that I found about how we think about neighbors. I think whether it's in Kashmir or the Northeast, that usually as children, we don't demonize, right? We aspire to learn. So thank you so much. The other, yes.
I'm sorry, I mean,
I want to listen to your reflection on that.
No, in your book, Ceasefire City, which was such an eye-opener for me, it was like a peep into the future. It's like a template of how cities will evolve, like the cities, places with disputed histories will evolve. And it's almost like a template that I could see Kashmir sort of moving towards. And it was like a crystal ball in a way, but you also talk about music, you talk about art, you show there's a picture that you use in your book of a trooper standing in a supermart. And recently someone tweeted saying a trooper in a supermart in Kashmir and it's the new normal. And it just promptly made me think of your book. So a lot of things, shared histories there. And regarding music, so we were listening to Pakistani music at that time. This Junoon, a Sufi rock band, was very, very popular. And we used to keep listening to their music all the time. But my sister would also listen to Mehdi Hassan. She would listen to Tina Sani. At the same time, she would listen to Mr. X in Bombay, or she would listen to Triday. But for me, it was music. It was basically that safe space that was familiar, that would make me switch to or wait till 1:30 in the morning to listen to Nepal radio, and they would always say Saade Ek Baj Rahe Hain, and I will play Hindi songs from the border, across the border.
Okay. The next question that I had kind of coming to my mind was how you make food and at the same time plants. I think the cover of your book says a lot about nature as well, that appears in your book as very integral. And I was wondering if you could talk about your childhood that you write about in this book, whether it was drying chilies or kind of the plants, the flowers that you picked, the seasons, the fruits. It was very kind of visible in that work. And I think this question, in a sense, is also to invite you to take us on a journey about how things like food, like plants, things around us, right, which really nurture our souls in the darkest of times. So can you tell us something about how, as you were writing, you were thinking about the theme of food and at the same time everything that was around, and that comes very, very beautifully.
Sure. So food, because I was working on the memoir and I was thinking of I was reliving those 90s and the years. So in examining and investigating memory, food was something that was ever present everywhere. So we used to, I had a very difficult relationship with food because, smell and memory is something, they just go, hand in hand. One triggers the other. And so food was something that was the first, I became aware of how I started withdrawing from life or even like the hint of depression when I look back later was my complicated relationship with food. Because it would remind you, let's say, I used to really love the potato curry that my mother used to make. And then potatoes became the staple diet during curfews. And you would only have potatoes with watery curry throughout. And you didn't know how long the curfew was going to last. So you would keep having that throughout. So earlier, what I used to really enjoy became associated with curfews and punishment and death. So the same thing happened with fish. My mother used to spend all Kashmiris. For example, there's a way Kashmiris cook their fish. It's over 3 days. You clean and fry the first day, then you cook it the next day and add layers of spices and veggies. And the third day, when it's cooled off, you don't have it hot because it can break. So you have it on the third day when it's cold. And there used to be these fisherwomen who used to come in neighborhoods and have this and sell their fish. With patrolling, increased militarization and violence, etc., they just disappeared from the streets as well. So it was again another. So it's not only in conflict zones how people die or they disappeared, but they're also living, how they get removed from the landscape, how they, so there's erasures of many kinds and many layers. So fish for me was like me remembering that woman coming over. She would open her basket in front of my grandmother in the courtyard. So there was this thing. And then that was completely gone. So you didn't know what happened to her. You didn't know. So food became, and then there was this cousin of mine who was my age, who was killed. I think probably one of the first few kids to die in a crossfiring. And we had cooked spinach and chicken. And it was Eid the next day. Until date, I can have it on a regular day, normal day. But if it's cooked around Eid, I will probably, I don't know. I mean, it's nauseating for me. I mean, as it is, the festival of Eid, I always associate with his death. So, and then food. And, when you read reports, to your first question, why did I write and how did I write? It was like these little things that happen to people, which we just normalize and we accept it as reality as growing up. But when you examine and investigate what it really was and how it was shaping you and the people around, it's actually, it's not as normal as it really seemed, so it's, yeah.
I think what you're saying is so important because, I mean, even I think my adult life, I've spent writing about human rights and engaging with gender justice. And I think at times we're very influenced by the media that when they cover Kashmir or the Northeast or even the Adivasi areas, they look for exceptional and extraordinary stories, right? That would make the headlines. But I think the everyday and the ordinary are the most extraordinary moments that shape us and who we are. And that's why I find your book so beautiful that, food is there and the honesty with which you write is there as well. And it really reminded me of the time that in the book, when you get lost, you go with your sister to the beauty parlor. Yeah. And that is that ordinary moment, right? Where no one would think that a trip for a little girl who is fascinated with beauty and looks up to her sister and goes to a beauty parlor has this horrifying experience. Yeah. And I think the body is all over your book. Even growing up as a teenager, when you write about trying to cover your body and your chest with a piece of cloth, I think it requires a lot of courage to write about this quote unquote ordinary moments that shape who we are and make us think. And would you like to take us on a journey with that? Yeah, especially the trip to the market and all things else. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, we're aware that how Kashmiri female body is fetishized, over exoticized. I mean, after August 5, 2019, there were ministers who actually said, now we'll get Kashmiri women and marry them off to our sons and we'll have Kashmiri children. And so, but it's also kind of violence, which is not committed through, definitive means of violence or power, but violence in I'd like to borrow this phrase from Teju Cole, this black writer, who talks about hot violence and cold violence. And this really is that, and the kind of repercussions it can have on you as a young girl, as women. It's like suppressing and subjugating a people in a very different way, which, like you said, is not TRP grabbing or is not headline grabbing. In fact, recently I was talking to this bunch of Kashmiri girls, young girls, and they said, I used to feel the same. I used to palpitate when we would, if I would make sound after curfew was imposed, the evening curfew. But I didn't know it was important enough to write. When I read your book and I thought, oh, we can actually write about these things, because that's what I'm saying. It feels so normal so quickly. And and you don't even realize that you are actually being a part of being, there's violence that's being heaped on you and you don't even realize. And then writing about these little transgressions was like you said, were most extraordinary things. We have Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich, who writes about these women, and she says like, women's war, like if you see war from a woman's perspective, it has colors, it has emotions, it has a very different courage that you see. I mean, you see physical bravery outside, you see it on the streets, which gets reported, which gets talked about, but there's this quiet moral courage that they really show. And I thought, that was like, how did it become normal and why is it normal? So that almost like comes under a layer of human rights, which will not fit in the conventional definition of it, to be honest. Yeah.
I think you make such a good point, and it takes me to the next topic that I really wanted you to share with us, and it's about this anxiety that you write throughout the book, and especially the menstruation part, right? I remember in my own experience, becoming a teenager in the 80s, and even the trip to go to buy sanitary pad was, that was something one had to plan. We had one, I think, big pharmacy in Dimapur at that time. It was called Medical Hall in Newmarket. And you talk about the anxiety of even going to the bathroom, right? And the period pains, and finding a way in that pain for leisure, that you would go into the storeroom, right? Just sit, and try to find your space. Can you tell us why that moment was so important for you to write the menstruation, and how it really becomes such an important part of the book for women?
Sure. So there's two parts to it. I mean, it's something that occurs on a monthly basis, and it's a reminder of that time every month. You hear people talk about, oh, just move on and deal with your past. But if it happens to you at an impressionable age, the fear seeps into you and mixes with internal pain, the external pain and internal pain sort of coalesce together. And it's a reminder every month. And then how do you come out of it? And how many people really talk about it? Because it becomes like, I've been looking at, and we all sort of look at how women become dual recipients of violence in conflict zones. So there is, and then there are these little moments, and there are these little episodes which is a very different kind of violence that you experience, or pain that you experience, again, which doesn't get spoken about. And I remember one of the young journalists had commented, oh, fine, her book is okay, she's written the first account and all of that, but why did she have to talk about the first crush and the periods? Because that can also make the people within the community uncomfortable. And that journalist actually said, how did your parents react? Did they read the book? I said, yeah, my mom, she sobbed, she cried when she read, especially that passage. And she was like, it was this guilt, like, was I really there for my daughter? Because a lot keeps happening in a conflict zone when the war is on. A lot keeps happening in the lives of adults, and children somehow get neglected. In a way, they just grow on their own, and then you see later what active parenting is and how conscious parenting is. And then you're like, how did I even survive that war? Like, how was it even possible to come out as a human being and not have, lost your mind completely as a child. Yeah.
Um, I know what kept you together, and it was your grandma, who is all over. And I loved her, and how much she was part of your life, and how you frame her so beautifully to be a witness of the people around you, the loved ones on Kashmir. But this book is for all of us, so I would like to claim it for all of us. And it leads me to the relationships that you write about. You offer so much generosity and insight into that world, your cousins, your aunties, your neighbors, your peers. And I can't forget that moment when you write about the post office being burned down. And letter writing was so much part of our life in the 80s, right? You get those pen pals, small booklets, and you try to find
And
friends.
so much on the stationery.
Yes, so much on the stationery, on the letters, on the writing, and your scribbling.
Yeah.
That's all over the book. Farah, tell us something about that.
Sure. So it was, the evenings started looking very different from how they were initially. So the curfew was imposed at 5:36, and and then you had the whole evening to yourself in a dimly lit room. I grew up in the interiors of the city, or Srinagar city, which is bustling, which was always bustling, and you would have traffic flying all the time. It was a very busy street, and that became completely quiet, and I couldn't deal with that quiet. Like, even now when I sleep, I have to have a little bit of light on. I can sleep better to noise when there's noise in the background than I can actually sleep when there's complete quiet and calm. So there were two things in the chapter. Boys, to be a guy or to be a boy in the early 90s in Kashmir was a very tricky thing. So either you join militancy and then you face the repercussions, you were killed or disappeared, or if you didn't become a militant, then you could be picked up on suspicion. And then there was people, the middle class especially, they send their kids out. So there was almost like, I liked this boy and I had a crush on him, and vice versa, but he went away. So it's like you see again another part of love then moving away from your place and it going away, and you don't want to lose it. And you're writing those letters and you're writing what happened here. I went back and I looked at some of the actual, I have some of the cards with me still. And it was almost like, it was not how a 17-year-old would write a love letter or a card or a love note. It was almost like giving the details of what's going on and what happened to the to whom, and because he was a distant cousin, so he sort of knew most of the people. So it was almost documenting memory. It was almost honoring memory at that point as a gesture in a way. And then I keep looking at it and it's like, where are these I miss yous? And there are no such things. What am I writing really? So in whatever language I knew at that point. So it was love was sort of, and life was leaving home in a way. And you were trying to hold on to what you could at that point. And that probably was the expression, because we barely knew each other, but then to have that the letter or through letters was like, again, holding on to life, and what are little things which give you hope, either for love or life in such times, in times of war. How with Viktor Frankl, he talks about when he was in a camp, in a concentration camp, and how he used to get these little pieces of paper, and when he didn't have a pen, he would just like write with stone or colored stone on it, whatever he could find. So writing and trying to document your life or write about your life in such circumstances is like, it's almost like you're hanging on to the notion of life, that I'm not completely, you're so aware of your own mortality, you may or may not live to see another day. So it's almost like a attempt to holding on to life. That's this love for life, I guess.
Okay, I'm going to hold on to that last few words you said, holding on to the lust, or the love for life, and ask you how this book is so remarkable, because you write about the state of curfew, about militarization, but it's almost kind of an assertion that you have as a writer that I'm not going to let the darkness be centered to it. I'm going to write about the people and bring in the spring, bring in the seasons, bring in the love that I had for my grandma, that cousin who was killed. And so it's in that spirit that I ask you this question. How is it that you managed not to write about the Indian state directly? Because so many books on conflict in India are so much about, right, just the goriness of violence, erasing people. But you managed to do the opposite. You managed not to write about the Indian state in that way, but make it so intrusive and violent at the same time. And I think that is the remarkable thing about this book. And I hope it inspires so many of us. And so perhaps this question then is about bringing on and retaining the humanity in writing about so much violence. So can you tell us about this process? And I think it's that writer in you that I'm requesting to guide us through. Thanks.
Thanks, Dolly. That was that was something you picked up so beautifully. I think it, like you said in your previous question, it began with my grandmother. I think I had that trauma of her being, so how we South Asians are, we really put our elders on we give them the respect that is due to them as they age, and especially grandparents, there's so much affection and love and bonding. And she was a kind of a person, she's very progressive. Like she really supported education in a completely patriarchal conservative setup. So my aunt went on to do a PhD without my grandfather knowing about it, because she supported it. And she wanted me to become a doctor because she thought, that was a very respectable profession. So, and then she would give career advices. She would give advices to people when life changed in the 90s. She was almost decimated. She shrunk as a person. No, she was in a foreign place. She didn't know what a bunker was. And she didn't even know how to pronounce it. And I would try it. It's not a banker, it's a bunker, the arrogance of a 14-year-old. And then I realized much later when I wrote the whole manuscript, I realized I had only two incidents or two passages after her death. So it was really about how I saw dwarfing of humanity through her decimation. She was this huge figure in my life. And it's not only like that love for my grandmother, but, how she had demonstrated her space, her place as a woman, and managed to command her own space, and how she was reduced to almost nothing. Like nobody knew, she didn't know what was going on, what would happen. So it was almost like reclaiming that our lives, women, and if you see, there are 9 chapters about my growing up, but there are 14 chapters about other women and their lives and how they were coping and not coping, or there are 10 chapters about the landscape changing. So it's like the mother reclaiming mother and the motherland in a way, and that was, no amount of darkness was going to permeate that, because it's so full of life. It's it's brimming with that. So I thought, there is, again, journalism, etc., which has taken care of that. And this is something that to get into the interiority of our own lives is not something that is either expected of us. We're always supposed to have a point of view of what's going on. But what about the lives? Then are we also being a part of the erasure that is being heaped on us? That was a question, probably.
I think what we erase, just to stay on that moment, maybe we have around 8 minutes, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. Just sticking on that point of erasure, you write in your book about a trip as a young girl to your aunt's place, and you talk about the lake. right? The lake, if you talk about Kashmir, it's really the lake that everything happens, the beauty, the paradise. But you write about the lake in a very different way, about boats, about the searchlight, about terror, and how that completely changed, transformed your aunt, who you loved, and the spirit in her. Tell us about that, Farah.
This is again, like you picked it up. It's again the beauty and the horror behind that beauty, which is very well sort of. There's this facade of beauty in a way, and so her aunt's the aunt's house was at the banks of this Nagin Lake, or is still there, and bank opposite their house was Nagin Club across the lake, and which was where the paramilitary used to live. So for the longest part in the 90s, the curtains would be drawn, the windows would be shut to a view which was really heavenly. But there was also a reminder that it's really not the heaven that you're living in. And then the water, which is supposed to bring you so much calm and tranquility, used to be the noisiest at night. And then there would be these search lights which would be flooded that would penetrate through the curtains. And then there was this cousin of mine who was 6 years old, and she used to live there, right? That was her home. And she used to be petrified of light for the longest time until she grew up. So usually a 6-year-old kid anywhere else in the world would be scared of darkness at night. But here you have a little Kashmiri girl who's petrified of light. And then she would start sobbing, and they had to take her to a faith healer to give her an amulet, and she would just hold on to it for those 10 minutes. And then and when we're growing up, there is no vocabulary for this kind of violence. How is she ever going to talk about it? And she spoke about it much later when I was writing, and I reminded her, and she very well remembered every single detail. She's like, I used to be so scared of the light. Until now, my aunt's house, the windows which open up to the lake and which to that view are still shut. The curtains are still drawn. So whether it was our home in the old parts of the city in Srinagar, which was in the middle of everything, and we used to shut our windows, and which were largely planks, like wooden planks. I mean, they had like the olden architecture is very different from now, how houses are built. So it was almost like you were living in the darkness, and yet it was touted as being this paradisical land, etc. So there was a lot of conflict and lots of juxtapositions that one grew up with. Like what was shown as beauty also had a very horrific reality to it. So I think this book also came, it's also an exploration of that conflict in your mind, of thoughts, of juxtapositions of a reality, and then a presented reality of an identity and an imposed identity. So all of that, I think.
Maybe we have like a few more minutes left, and I want to take full advantage of that as well, and ask you this last and final question, and it's for all the young ones out there who are trying to write, who are trying to think that what is considered ordinary and what is considered extremely mundane in their lives are so central to it. And I find myself in my research role talking to a lot of young students from the Northeast. The first thing they do is self-erasure, right? Because they think that their lives are not important. And what's happened to them, the extraordinary decades of counterinsurgency and militarization, is not important. And I think your book stands as a testimony why this witnessing is important, and why we need to make state and state agencies accountable, keeping humanity at the center of it. Because the moment we talk about dehumanizing, I think we have already lost the politics. Yeah. And I think that's where we find a hook to talk about greater things like justice and hope. Farah, with this beautiful book that you have written, give a message to the young ones out there everywhere who are thinking about their lives and that the ordinariness of violence is just immaterial.
Thank you. That's a very that's such a profound thought. I mean, it's like, I think it's like you said, to identify. I mean, I think if you consume so much of dehumanizing about your own people, it does work on our psyche at some level. We do internalize it. It's like years of misogyny or patriarchy, for example. And this is also like an aspect, a similar aspect of when a people are dehumanized or demonized for so long, do you actually start believing that? Which Fanon almost tells us, like how there are house Negroes, he has this term. How do they come up? Because they don't feel worthy. They don't feel, their lives they don't feel worthy to themselves. So it's about realizing that who we are as people and what rights do we have as basic humans, basic life, or living a life of dignity. Forget anything else. When that dignity is taken away from you, then what are you reduced as? And then who are you really, I don't want to use the term helping, but what are you actually, are you then being complicit in? I mean, it's not a deliberate hand in that obfuscation of identity, but I think realizing your own worth as an individual in such a place, every single detail matters, every single ordinariness matters, because when you have some distance from it, you really realize it's not that ordinary. And then you read other literature, and then you realize how this is actually important, and yeah, you can't run away from it. I think we're running out.
Thank you so much for writing this. Thank you. And this is a book, people. Please take it and read it and make it a gift to yourself. Thank you, Farah Bashir.
Thank you so much, Dolly Kikon. Thank you, Bangalore Lit Fest. Thanks for having this conversation.